Hey everybody, welcome back to another video, and I'm super excited about what I'm going to be talking about today because it's something that's going to kind of kick off the start of our growing season here in 2025, and it's one of the first videos of a series that I'm going to be putting out there about starting your own seeds indoors. And so in today's video, we're going to be talking about what size containers you should be using for starting your own seeds indoors. So we're going to be going over everything about containers and what type of size you should be using, where you can get them, and some other things in between. So stay tuned, and all of that and more is coming next. Now, when choosing containers to start your seeds indoors, there are a ton of options to choose from. So many different size containers, so many different shapes, and it can be kind of hard to decide which sizes to use. But I found that you can really make this decision a lot easier if you break it up into two categories. And these are how much space you have and how many plants you're actually going to want to grow. Considering both of these factors is going to be huge in deciding what size pots you're actually going to be able to work with. Because if you want to start, let's say, a lot of seeds, but you don't have enough space to do that, you're going to have to start in something smaller. Now, if you're growing for, let's say, just your family and you only want to start maybe 20 to 50 plants, and you have one rack, enough lighting to house all of those plants, you can definitely start in something larger, something that you don't need to later pot up in, something like these 3.25-inch pots. These are perfect and will last your plant most of its growing cycle up to the point to where you can transplant them into their garden or into their forever home. But if you have that same amount of space and you want to grow for your family and somebody else's family, or maybe you want to do a plant sale, you're going to have to start in something smaller, something like these smaller cells. Now, the important thing to consider is that all plants need sufficient lighting. We've already talked a little bit about that. But the other thing to consider is that when plants get to a certain size, they don't need as much light. They don't need the intense direct sunlight or light that the grow lights are going to put off, like they do when they're very young, when the seeds first break the soil surface. At this point, it is super important to give your plants a lot of light. So what I like to do is I usually start all of my seeds in the smaller cells because I can fit so many underneath my grow lights, and I can give them the exact amount of hours of sunlight that they need. All of the things that plants need when they first break the soil, I can give it to them at an intense level, compared to where if I was starting in the larger containers, I just simply cannot fit hundreds of plants in these containers underneath the grow lights. So for me personally, growing hundreds of plants every year, I have to start in the smaller containers. But again, if you are somebody who is not growing that many plants and have enough space to start in the larger containers, by all means, I highly encourage you to do that because honestly, it's really the best route. You don't have to pot up. Potting up is probably one of the most time-consuming parts of the whole seed starting process. And it's one of those things that you don't have to do if you have enough space and you want to start in the larger containers. But again, one of the most important things to note is the lighting aspect of things. You don't want your seedlings to get leggy, stretch because they just aren't receiving enough light because you're trying to cram too many of these larger pots underneath. If that is the case and you're worried about lighting, just take the extra step. Potting up does take more time, but take the extra step. Start in the smaller containers, and trust me, you're going to be able to fit all of those plants underneath the light, and you are going to have a lot more plants. Though it does take more time, you're going to have a lot more plants that you're going to be able to plant come spring. So of all the pots that are out there that you can choose from, I've kind of come down over the years to a specific number of sizes and containers that I use personally, that have all done amazing for what I need. I've started thousands of plants, and these are all of the containers that I've used for the last couple of years. I haven't had to use anything else. So starting with these is, like I mentioned before, the 6 cell. You can get a lot of these for pretty cheap. They're just the thin plastic 6 cell containers, and 72 come per flat. So you could fit 72 plants in a 10 by 20 tray or a flat. And that's a lot of plants that you can fit in a relatively small space. Generally, these last about 4 weeks for most plants. 4 to 6 weeks you can get out of these, especially for things like tomatoes, peppers. Those generally take, like I said, 4 to 6 weeks in here before you want to really pot them up into the larger containers. Of course, you do want to go based on the roots. So once you start seeing the roots curl at the bottom of the container, that's generally a good sign that you should transplant them. You don't want them getting all root bound in there. But generally, like I said, 4 to 6 weeks. Now, one thing to note is you don't want to start your larger seed varieties in here. Things like watermelon, squash, zucchini, cucumbers. Those are all things that are very fast growing, and they're larger seeds, so they're going to put out a root system very quickly. And most of the time, within a week probably, the roots are going to be coming out of the bottom, and it's just not a good start to those type of plants life cycle. So for me, the things that I like to start are herbs, tomatoes, peppers, your smaller flower varieties, things that take a little bit longer to first start growing. You don't want something that's going to grow super quickly, otherwise you're going to run out of time within a week, and then your plants are going to struggle and you're going to have to get them back on track. So start with those type of things. Tomatoes and peppers, herbs, things like that especially are perfect for the 6 cells. The next size container that I like to use are the 4 cells. So these are a bit bigger. These I can generally get away with starting my watermelon, squash, some of those bigger, faster growing varieties that we talked about. And because I do a plant sale every year, which I might put a video out there about how I do a plant sale. If any of you guys are interested in that, put in the comments that you are so that I know to make a video about doing a plant sale. These I generally use, again, about 4 to 6 weeks indoors, but I use them for those larger seeded varieties. They do wonderful. I've had great success growing watermelon, cantaloupe. I've grown cucumbers in here, squash varieties in here, lots of different things in here, and they have done great. Now, these are still smaller, as you can see, but they are about twice the size of these, and they will get away with those larger varieties for about 4, 5, 6 weeks. After that, if you still need more time, frost is still lingering outside, you're going to want to pot them up into the larger containers. But this will give you a 4 to 6 week head start indoors on top of your growing season that you can do that with. And again, you can do any other type, things like this, the tomatoes, peppers, herbs. You can do all of those in here as well. You can probably get 6 to 8 weeks in here doing those type of things. Again, going based on the root systems. But I think tomatoes and peppers I've done in the past, really about 6 to 8 weeks that I can get away with these indoors. So another perfect thing that I like to use every once in a while for my plants. The next size container that I absolutely love and I have used for many years now, it is my #1 favorite size pot, the 2.5 inch larger containers. So these will get me away with full size starter plants from seed all the way up to transplant time. So tomatoes and peppers, sometimes I can get upwards of 14 weeks out of these if I need to. Herbs, same thing. You can start your bigger seed, faster growing varieties, squash, watermelon, all of those types of things in here as well. And you can get upwards of 6 to 8 weeks in these. A perfect and fantastic size pot that I use for pretty much everything. I sell all of my plants in the 2.5 inch pots just because I can get very nice size, large plants out of this relatively small container. Again, the main thing that we're talking about is being able to fit as many plants as we can with the space that we have. And these, compared to the larger containers, it's almost half the size of them. and I can fit almost twice as many plants as I can the larger containers. So if you're looking for a container to just start your seeds in, not need to transplant any of them, you just want to start them in here from their seed stage all the way up to harvest, the 2.5-inch pot is the way to go. Now, the last container that I use every once in a while is the 3.25-inch pot. And I did talk about these a little bit in today's video before, but these pots, like I said, I don't use that often. I just kind of use these for things that take a little bit longer to mature. Things like super hot peppers, for example, they can take 120, 130 days to mature or more. And in a growing season like I'm in zone 5, we don't have the number of days to be able to get a great harvest off of something like that. So if I want an amazing harvest, or a harvest that's better than what you could get in some of these smaller containers and get the head start indoors, I like to start them in these larger containers just so I can get that head start. I can get more of a harvest later on. These can create some monster plants. You can get probably 16 weeks out of these, and super established plants that go outside. They're not overly root bound. And though they do take up more space, I can get larger plants and I can get them to mature faster outside and get more of a harvest later in the season. So again, I don't use these for everything just because of the space that I have. I'm limited on space. So I want to use most often the smaller containers, but these are perfect every once in a while for getting longer maturing plants established and getting more time so that I get more of a harvest later in the season. Now, another thing to highly consider is the fact that you're growing these plants indoors. You're not growing them outside where evaporation happens quicker. Sunlight evaporates the water inside of these containers. When you're growing them indoors, a lot of times it's just sitting in these containers. And 9 times out of 10, that can be not good in the health of your plants. Most plants do not like super soggy, wet soil, and that can happen super easily when you're indoors, especially when you're growing in the larger containers. So I wanted to kind of put out there that starting in the smaller containers sometimes is often better when you're growing things that are more vulnerable to root rot and some of those other water diseases or diseases that can happen from overwatering. And I say this because if you're starting something that is more vulnerable to diseases that happen from too much moisture and you want to start them in the larger containers, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a lot harder to control that moisture and control how much water is going into these larger pots. And the other thing is that it will take much longer for that water to evaporate in these larger containers than it will the smaller containers. So, like I said, the seeds and the small seedlings, they're a lot more vulnerable to these problems when they're young. The larger they get, the easier these plants can handle the water and the excess moisture. The quicker it's going to evaporate and be soaked up into the plant. But when they're smaller, they just cannot handle that much water. And I'm telling you, I've lost so many plants from this because of the simple fact that I overwatered my plants, or that water did not evaporate quickly enough for those plants to be able to keep themselves healthy, and they just ended up sitting in that water and dying in the end. So in my experience, I would start them in these smaller containers because if you overwater them, you can take out the plugs, you can wrap them in paper towel, get rid of that excess moisture, or that moisture is just going to evaporate 10 times quicker in these smaller cells than they will the larger ones. And overall, you're just able to control that moisture much better in these smaller containers. And I've lost way less plants in these than I have the larger containers. And when saying that, I'm not saying don't put them in these at all. Once they outgrow these containers, of course, you can pot them up into the larger ones. By that size, like I said, they're going to be ready to take that extra moisture. They're actually going to want some of that extra moisture because they're larger. But until that point, start them in the smaller containers. You'll thank me later. And that's pretty much it for today's video. These are the main containers that I use and that I've used for many years now. But feel free to try out some other size containers. See what you guys enjoy most, what you guys have the most success with. But for me, these are the main size containers, and I really just wanted to share that with you, share some of my tips of what I do when choosing them at the beginning of each year, and so on and so forth. Make sure to follow, because like I said, this is the first video in what I hope to become a very long series of videos, all the way up to planting your seeds to harvesting your plants outside in the garden. So make sure you stay tuned, subscribe, because we have a ton of content coming soon. And make sure you check out our seed shop as well, because we've got tons of awesome varieties that you can get your hands on and you can get planted and follow along with us as we grow. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.